Good morning, everyone. Do you like graphs? If you said no, this is going to be a rough 15 minutes, okay? I like graphs. I'm just going to give us a quick overview of kind of the broad strokes, and then Matthew, Molly, and I are going to talk about what we're seeing in the data, what we think the future of the church looks like. So let's get to it, shall we? This is not my favorite graph to show. So the main line, which you all, sometimes I get this talk, people are like, what are main line? I don't have to have that talk with you guys. In the 1950s, the church enrollment data says about half of all Americans were mainline Protestants. Just think about that for a second. In the late 1950s, 52% of all Americans were on the rolls of a mainline Protestant church. The General Social Survey started asking these questions in 1972, and by 1975, mainline Protestant Christianity had already dropped to about 30% of America. So between the late 1950s and early 1970s, we saw a 20-point drop in 15 years. And then the drop that I really kind of stare at a lot is the drop from 28% to 19%. You can see it right there between the late 1980s and late 1990s, and then the main line has continued to decline. The most recent data in the General Social Survey says that 9% of all American adults align with a mainline Protestant tradition. That's down from, just roll that around in your mind for a second, 52% in the late 1950s to 9% today. It might be one of the most under-discussed shifts in American religion. I talk about the rise of the nuns a lot. I think this might actually be more consequential in many ways. And you can also see this reflected in denominational statistics as well. This is not just survey data. This is also reflected in the membership rolls of the Seven Sisters of the Mainline, which I was a pastor of the American Baptist Church. We're down only, actually it's worse than that. There's an error in the data. We're down 30%. The Disciples of Christ is down 75% since 1987. The ELCA is down 45%. The Presbyterian Church USA is down 62%. You guys are honestly doing better than most. How's that feel, right? Yeah! Only down 36% since 1987. It could be worse. The United Church of Christ is down 57%. And then the United Methodists are down 40%, but that number actually does not reflect the post-schism numbers, which are even worse than that. Here's a stunning statistic for you. In 1968, the United Methodist Church was about the same size as the Southern Baptist Convention. And now the Southern Baptist Convention, although it has lost 3 million people recently, is still 13 million, and the United Methodists are 4.8 million. I mean, you can't see a more divide than that between the United Methodists and the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, let's zoom in on the Episcopal Church specifically. The high water mark for Episcopalians in America was 1959, 3.4 million. And actually, the number was relatively steady around that figure for a while, for all the way through, almost through the 60s. And then it's just been a slow and steady decline over time. It dropped below 2 million right around 2004 or so. And today the number is 1.54 million as reflected in the 2023 data. So the church is down from about 3.4 million at its peak to 1.5 million now. That's a much smaller share of the overall population of America too. Let's be clear about that, because population has grown. Here is ASA, as the Episcopal Church likes to call it. Everyone calls it something different. I do a lot of denominational stuff, and everyone has different terms for things, so I'll use yours, ASA, average Sunday attendance, right? 725,000 in 2009. And then I put the percentage declines across the bottom so you can kind of get a sense of what that looked like. The average decline between 2009 and 2019 was 2.9%, okay? That's not great when you compound that over a decade. And you can see that the numbers were declining from 725,000. Now, right before COVID, it was 547, And then the first impacted COVID number was 485,000 in 2020. And that really didn't reach full flower until 2021. The bottom out number was 293,000. Now, there is good news here, everybody. Attendance has rebounded. It's up. It was up 27% in 2022, and it was up another 10% in 2023. On an average Sunday in America, there are 411,000 Episcopalians in worship. For context, the Southern Baptist Convention has about 10 times that number in worship on an average Sunday, and non-denoms are even higher than that. The Assemblies of God has about 3 times that number, 1.2 million in worship on an average Sunday. So just some context there. How bad did COVID hurt attendance figures in the Episcopal Church? I can actually give you a pretty good estimate of this. So what I did here is just shoot a straight line through the data from 2009 to 2019 and just shot that line all the way through 2023, assuming if the trend line held, how many people would be ASA in the church in 2023? The answer is 475,000. The actual number is 411,000. So that means that COVID cost the Episcopal Church about 64,000 ASA, about 15% decline from what it should have been. I've done this same analysis in the Assemblies of God, in the Southern Baptist Church, in the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. They all are right around 15% off of what they should have been if COVID didn't happen. So you guys are right in line with what I'm seeing in other denominations. 15% decline in average Sunday attendance. That's the norm here. Plate and pledge. Now, the important thing to note here is these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. Okay, so actual giving in real number dollar terms is down over time, but it is pretty staggering to think about this fact that as average Sunday attendance has dropped from 725,000 to 411,000, that plate and pledge has held relatively steady over that time period. When I talk to folks about what do I think the major problems are facing different denominations, for Episcopalians, money is not top of list. Okay, that one is definitely a secondary concern when you look at data like this. Now, obviously, costs are rising, inflation's up, but donations are doing very, very well. And what sunk my church was the money. The money ran out. That's why we had to stop worshiping, and that's less of a concern systematically. Now, here's what I love about the Episcopalians. They don't just give you ASA. They also give you numbers like baptisms and burials and confirmations and marriages. So you get a more complete picture of what the church is up to beyond attendance numbers. That's helpful because then you can see what the future might look like, okay? As you can see, there was a huge drop in baptisms during COVID, which makes sense. Then the number actually jumped back up. In the last 2 years, it was actually higher than it was in the pre-COVID numbers. Now, you know what I think is happening there? We're clearing the baptism backlog of the 2020-2021 class who did not get baptized. But the numbers have rebounded quite nicely on baptisms. Burials were down during COVID, but are now really back at that baseline, that 25,000, 26,000 per year. I think that's the number going forward. Confirmations, huge. The church only confirmed 3,700 people in 2020. And now we're seeing that number come back up. You're not seeing that number get back above the 2019 figures, guys. To me, that's a warning sign, okay? The baptism numbers are good. The confirmation numbers are soft. They should be back above that 15,000 mark, and they're not. So that's something to worry about. And marriages have been relatively steady. I was actually kind of shocked to see that during COVID, marriages in the church did not drop that much. I thought they would drop a lot more. So here's what I did here. The left bar is how many I thought the church would do based on prior statistics, and the right bar is how many they actually did. So interestingly enough, the baptism number was only down about 5,000 from what it should have been. Now, The burial number was also down 8,000. The confirmation number, I would have guessed almost 50,000 confirmations between 2020 and 2023. The actual number was only 41,000. So of all these numbers that I look at, to me, that is the one that's the scariest. Okay, that does not portend a good future, because for all the baptisms, you got to get them through confirmation, right, to keep them in the church. And I think that's the leakiness that I would worry about. Then the marriages are very steady, kind of where you would expect. Here's the bigger problem. The church is old. And this is your own statistics, by the way. The survey data backs us up, FYI. I mean, this is consistent across many different surveys. Half of the Episcopal Church has reached their 65th birthday. As from a demographic perspective, that's bad. There's no other way to spin this than that's really bad. Because what makes it worse is those bottom two numbers. So you've got 13% of Episcopalians are under the age of 18. If you assume that every one of those children will stay in the church as adults, which is a terrible assumption, it's about 60% retention, FYI, in the main line. So just think about that for a second. That means in 30 years, the church is going to be 35 to 40% smaller just based on attrition, right? Older people dying and not being replaced by that many young people coming into the pews. If all this holds, ASA could easily be 200 to 225,000 in 25 years. I mean, it's a real problem that is not easy to solve. I say this as a guy who pastored a church where I was the youngest person by 40 years. Young couples would come in and see all the gray hair and go, I don't know, that's not what I'm here for, and would leave. It's not easily overcome either. That's the bigger problem. There's no magic to make it work. So, I know you guys liked all those slides and all those graphs. I'm going to sit down now and let Molly and Matthew. Molly, what do you got? What are you feeling?
Well, I think I always like to remind folks of the historical context when we talk about the sort of big picture of the Episcopal Church, and we think back to that peak. And my favorite slide in my collection is the slide that maps the membership of the Episcopal Church alongside the birth rate of the United States in the 20th century, because those curves look remarkably similar. So I think we sometimes think our grandparents were better at evangelism than we are. And that's not how we got those people in the 1950s and the 1960s, right? It was because the people who were already in our pews had a lot of kids. But the population in the United States is enormous. So it's way bigger than it was in 1960. Yeah. So how about, the growth possibilities are endless. They're just not going to come the way we've previously come. But the other piece I like to say is that we've done this before as a church. Mm-hmm. We're about numerically the same size we were in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. Also, it's important to remember that we were not very popular in the United States in the wake of the American Revolution. We'd previously taken oaths to kings and things, so we weren't. So this thing of decline and rising and growing and changing as a church, we've done this multiple times before, and it was only in the mid 20th century that we started to have more clergy than our congregations. So we have a tendency to look sort of too narrowly sometimes, and I think when we take the wider historical context, we think, oh wait, this is not so challenging. Our ancestors did this before, and the church changed, and it adapted for the context in which it's in. And so I think there's great possibilities, and especially because, as you noted, financial resources collectively, they're not evenly distributed in the Episcopal Church. Yes. Collectively, financial resources are not our problem, and as Bishop Sean has noted at times too, right, we still punch above our societal weight, given our numbers. So we have an outsized impact in and voice in the society, given that we're like one of the smallest ones on your graph there. Yeah. But we have a prominent voice in the society, and we have an opportunity to use that for real good.
I mean, Marion Buddy was the one who spoke to President Trump before he took the oath.
Yes.
An Episcopal priest, right?
Bishop, but she's a bishop.
Bishop, that's right. A bishop, correct. And I mean, it just shows you the outsized role that I mean, when I talk to other people, they don't even know what disciples of Christ is. You know, like that. There's some denominations that are large-ish, but the average person just does not know. Yeah. Everyone knows the Episcopal Church. Like that's.
Well, the National Cathedral is ours. So
absolutely right.
We do presidential funerals too. Yep.
Matthew, what do you got?
I'm really interested in that COVID line, and I still think we're trying to figure out, I mean, with the Hartford folks on their EPIC, exploring the pandemic's influence on congregations, what exactly has happened and what those lingering effects are. So I have two roles. One is head of research at Church Pension Group. The other one is the guy that does the coffee at St. Luke's, Montclair. And
very prestigious, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, you know, you're asking me about the future of the church. On Sunday, somebody will ask me why we ran out of half and half. And I mean, it's the same answer. It's a complicated problem, and I'll need to get back to it. So, but
it really is.
One of the things, you know, pre-COVID, there were like 6 teams with 10 people on it, and, you know, every team showed up, and then suddenly, even when we went back, you know, you struggle to find people. And everyone who I think has an opportunity to do something, to go to a play, to visit relatives, to take that spontaneous trip, has now decided, I think, maybe I won't get to do this next year. You know, there's some lingering part that people are holding back. Our ASA has kind of rebounded in roughly the same way. But something has changed. Like committees that I'm on just have attendance at 60% that used to have everybody show up. Yeah. And I just wonder what that is. And I know that from surveys that we do, surveys that other denominations have done, that clergy are also feeling this. Both that they themselves are stressed and that they may have, in some ways, less support from their laity who are also going through that. So I wondered if you would just, you know, I think that the fall in ASA, which is slightly lower than you would have projected, is a symptom of something larger that is happening in our society.
I also think that it's worth noting that that number is an in-person attendance.
Yes.
So, right, we have consistently collected that for a very long time, so we have continued to ask for in-person Sunday attendance so that we do have that trend data. There's not a good consensus among all of us who look at religious data how to measure online attendance.
Correct.
And
yes.
and then the metrics on the platforms also keep changing. So
yes.
it's a squishy process. It's hard to get hard data out of it. On the other hand, we know that lots of churches, and we know this from our data, and as Matthew mentioned, the EPIC survey and the Faith Communities Today surveys, that, you know, lots of churches are online now that weren't in 2019.
Correct. Yep.
And there are people who are engaged and in it in that way. And I think there's some survey data coming from EPIC and from FACT, and especially in the course of this year, that I think will tell us a lot more about what that kind of engagement looks like for those folks, because we at least anecdotally know that many of those people, they're never going to walk in the door, because you know what? They live 300 miles away or they live 4,000 miles away. So they're never coming in the door. And yet they are somehow meaningfully engaged with this community. And so I think it's not an equal thing to say, well, if you put the online number next to the thing, right, that's not a fair comparison, because they're very different data. Yeah. And I do think that's an area that's worth exploring, and you know, it doesn't necessarily address the, you know, not enough volunteers at coffee hour, and because how do you have coffee hour on Zoom, and or committee pieces. I mean, some of
Right.
that can be accomplished on Zoom, and it's not quite the same, but I think that's an important piece to bring into the mix.
The data on online attendance. So before COVID happened, about 35% of churches were streaming their service.
Yeah.
And this year, 95% of churches will stream part of their worship service. It's one of the biggest technological, like,
huge.
punctuated equilibriums we've ever had.
Yep.
But Pew did a survey, like, right in the middle of COVID, and they asked people, do you watch online or do you go in person, or both, right? And what the data says, interestingly enough, is the people who are the most likely to watch online church are people who go weekly in person. I call them like super heavy consumers of religion. Like they can't get enough of it. You know what I mean? They go to their local congregation, but then they'll watch a nationally known pastor on TV on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. The share of Americans who are honest to God virtual attenders, like they go in person less than once a year, but attend online once a week, is about 5%. Which is not nothing, don't get me wrong. Like, let's be very clear. Everyone matters, and I think
Right.
the ableist conversation matters in this context.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, the online audience is not nearly what we think it is in terms of like bringing new people into the fold. Right. The people who are honestly just going online is incredibly small. And the data says that almost all the benefits you get from church are showing up in person on a regular basis. So like you have to hold both those ideas in tension at the same time.
Absolutely.
It's like, yes, we want to be open to online people, but also understand that online is probably an inferior version of what we're doing in person.
Yeah.
It should be the backup plan.
There's an interesting concept that some research at Pew came up with, that congregations sort of create network density by finding overlap. So, you know, a member of our congregation also supports Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. And hence my ability to live with perpetual disappointment. And so we then, you know, put me into, we then go to the Tottenham Hotspur Supporters Club in Montclair, headed up by somebody with the surname Parker Bowles, but, you know, we were, so. But that sense of which you're there and, you know, your kids also go to the same school and you have those points of contact. And I think when we hit the edge of those difficult moments, that network density is what, in a sense, keeps people in the congregation and connected. And that, Pew found, is hard to get online because, you know, if it's just clicking one link as opposed to the other, then your ability to connect and then also to be that Christ-centered community but just becomes more complicated and harder. So as time goes on, I think being deliberate about what you do when you're together, I think is key. And not just having that network density happen accidentally, but also maybe actually that's something that everyone needs to cultivate.
I think that we have to realize that online is good, but it does not create that network. It does not create those, the water cooler moments, the walking through the hallway moments. To me, the most important part of church is the 10 minutes before and the 10 minutes after church.
Definitely the 10 minutes after, because that's the beginning of coffee hour.
That's exactly right. But that's where you make connections with people, right? That's where you talk to friends. You set up play dates with your kids, or double dates with different. That's where a young single person can find another young single person in the congregation. I've been telling pastors often and often and often that if you went to div school, you thought about the vertical aspect of religion a lot, right? The theology stuff, the divinity stuff. I'm a social scientist. You know what church is? It's a voluntary gathering of random people once a week in my world. Let's think about the horizontal and the social impact that your church can have on your congregation. And they've got the social part of it is what got me through some of my darkest hours. And when I didn't believe, they believed for me.
Yes.
And when they didn't believe, I believed for them. Right. When both my kids were born, there was a pot of chili on the doorstep when we got home from the hospital. Who's going to bring the chili to the online worshipers? not to denigrate that, but to say like there is a very good role that the church has to play in a day-to-day life of people. And the Episcopal Church every church needs to think about that a lot more. And what I tell congregations is think about doing stuff that's purely social. That does not have, evangelicals are terrible. Everything has to have an evangelism sermon or a praise and worship time. No, just hang out for 2 hours. There's one small thing your church can do right now, by the way, do coffee hour after church, and don't have your janitor turn the lights off 10 minutes after the service is over. You know what I mean? Like trying to usher people out the door as soon as you're done. Let those people ruminate and marinate and talk to each other and socialize with no expectations for how long it would last. That is how you draw people in. I think that's how you evangelize now, by the way. Philip Yancey said no one became a Christian because they lost the argument. You know why, in the Great De-Churching, the number one reason why we asked people, why would you come back? What's the number one reason you would come back? You know what it is? Friends.
Yep.
That's the thing that showed up over and over and over again is friends. Friends are friends forever if the Lord's the Lord of them. So where does the church go from here, Molly?
Well, I think there's a real possibility there in your piece and what we're talking about in terms of the community building aspect of church. I also think, right, if we look at the, Surgeon General's report on loneliness, or we think about the study, the data we got during COVID of, what people are seeking, community, people are seeking meaning making. I think that's one of the things, actually, that's like one of the best kept secrets of the Episcopal Church, is that we actually are really good tools, theological tools, liturgical tools, tradition, history, all of those pieces that can help people make meaning in the midst of challenges and crises. And that looks like, yes, chili on your doorstep at a life event, but it also looks like the kind of community where you can have hard conversations and where you can talk about the difficult moments of life and you can hold the faith for each other in those times when one of us might be struggling with it. And the ways in which we can support each other and open up those possibilities and be together in those midst. And yes, it's hard to be together online in the same way that you can be in the pews on Sunday morning and, and at coffee hour. And so I think helping to share that community and invite people into that, because people are seeking that across our society, and we actually do it really well.
What about the age problem, Matthew? Like, to me, of all the problems.
Are you talking personally?
No!
I was just wondering. I mean, I know
You're young and spry.
Yeah, well,
You're not a wily veteran.
son.
To me, how does the church can the church overcome the age problem? How to lower the median age of the average Episcopalian?
So I think that this comes down to sort of some questions around ordination too and leadership.
Yeah.
Which is hard because in some ways you want to ordain for the church, not that you are, but for the church that you want to be. But that means that you're looking in a sense for people to give their lives to the church for a career of, of 30 plus years, which is relatively low paid, high stress, isolating, but with a fantastic pension at the end, I would just say.
And you would know, right?
And
you would know.
But that's a lot. I mean, just to say to somebody, in 30 years, you'll get this thing. So
yeah.
I think that, but if we look in terms of age, in terms of diversity, I think we need to be very deliberate around the leadership that we get. Because if that's the sort of, it's not exactly solving the age problem. I mean, every congregation believes, if we just get, a young pastor in and we'll get lots of young people. Well, we've seen that doesn't work. But I do think at some level, again, looking at this deliberately, we need that variety of religious perspectives. And I'm actually quite encouraged by one sort of model that I made, predictive model, that actually failed to be true. I mean, there's many of them, but one of them was encouraging. And it was that if you sort of go through each generation, and the rise of the nuns, which of course you are the nun man, you would expect that each generation would have a lower and lower number of people who would go into the priesthood. And to some degree that's true, but actually the biggest drop has been amongst midlife ordinations. Oh, and the younger ordinations are holding up actually quite well. And I really don't know why. And so I was going to ask you, as the expert on these things, why do you think somebody in their 20s would make the bold decision to say, I am going to do this with my life? And what do you think their friends would say?
That's a great... So I actually had a student email me last week who took my religion and politics class and goes, Dr. Burge, I think I want to go to divinity school. I've never had that happen before. Like, he was like, what do I do? And I'm like, oh my goodness, I have to think about this for a minute. What do you do? I think, so the Pew Research Center released a big report this week. I'm pretty sure most of you have seen it. I got 17 calls from every reporter wanting for me to give like color to the... Funny thing was, the report had been bouncing around for 2 weeks, and they embargoed it, but they wanted me to comment on a report that I couldn't read, which is the best thing ever. I'm like, can someone just send it to me, for goodness sakes? This isn't like state secrets here. The big top line finding is Christianity has leveled off. It's not declining anymore. And the nuns have also leveled off, which I wrote about this a year and a half ago, by the way. I'll just put that out there. I got to say it. Around 30%. So Christianity is around 63%, and the nuns are around 30%. I do think, and by the way, the Gen Z numbers say that the youngest version of Gen Z, so like the ones who are just coming into adulthood, are actually slightly more religious than the older version of Gen Z. So that trend line is actually stopping or maybe even turning downward. And I do think that a lot of young people feel like, I think we've reached the end of postmodernity, honestly. You know what I mean? Like this idea of like, like I'm okay, you're okay, like there is my least favorite thing is my truth is, okay, whatever. You know what I mean? Like we got, at some point, everything cannot be shifting sand in this world. There's an idea in political science called constructivism. It's like we create every reality. Like countries don't exist, money. I go, students, I'm going to talk to you about this for 5 minutes and stop thinking about it because it will ruin your life. I think they're done with that. And I think a lot of young people are looking for some firm foundation. They're looking for something historical and traditional, which is exactly what the Episcopal Church can provide. This is not a church that started 5 years ago in a warehouse. This is a church that dates back hundreds of years, with theology and liturgy and history and all those things. And I think that's what, and I actually think the vast majority of young people, even young non-religious people, have a deep and abiding respect for a young person who's willing to give their life to service of something greater than themselves. And that could be the military, could be public service, but it could be, Christian service. I see very little antagonism towards religion amongst my students. A lot of it is just sort of like blind curiosity. They don't know anything and they want to know more. My religion and politics class fills up every time because young people are desperate to understand religion because a lot of them were raised with such little religious education. They don't understand the mainline and evangelicals. They don't understand the Catholic Church and all. They don't understand the consistent ethic of life. That's always a fun conversation I have. Like, did you know the Catholic Church actually teaches a very consistent theology of these issues? Now, no one in the pews believes it, but they do teach it from the pulpits. And you would be amazed at when I teach that, they all go, okay, I can respect that. They might not agree with it, but they'll have a lot of respect for a consistent worldview based on something eternal, foundational. I think that's where we are now. We're seeing, listen, don't go out and do it. Brian Burge said we're going to have a religious revival in this country. I am not saying that. But I think we're in a new era of American religion right now, where there's a lot more openness. The era of new atheism is over. You know, the Hitchens and the Dawkins and the Sam Harrises of the world, no one listens to those guys anymore. And what we're doing, we're moving into a new era. And I think the Episcopal Church is actually well situated to say, if you want to be a Christian, but you don't want to be an evangelical, we are a great option.
Yes.
Or American Baptist, obviously.
So before I worked on the churchwide staff, I was the Dean of Formation in the Diocese of Connecticut and working with people in the ordination process. And we, partially because, there's a great seminary, I have to tout it because it's mine, in our backyard in Connecticut. And so we would get a lot of young people coming in who start out like your student. I want to go to divinity school and I'm curious. Yep. And then they find the Episcopal Church and they want to be ordained. And so we would get a lot of people both, coming up from parishes in Connecticut, but also coming to us from Berkeley. And so, and the thing that I loved about working with those folks, and I think that's really true especially about the folks who are younger, and wasn't just the folks who are younger, but there was a real tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, and an ability to look at the landscape and be open and curious and excited and see possibilities for transformation. They didn't see decline and depression. Well, because, so I was born in 1980, right? The church has been declining my whole life, and I've had this same prayer book my whole life, and they've been ordaining women my whole life. So, I don't have this other thing I'm hearkening back to, because this is how it's been my whole life. Yeah. And so this is the water we swim in, and so we're not seeking after some past thing. We're seeking, hope and possibility and transformation for the future, and thinking, and looking at it and thinking, especially in a place like Connecticut, there's a lot of resources around here. There's a lot of congregations too. You could almost throw a baseball between them in some places. And so there's real possibility for collaboration, for collegiality, for working together and building something new. So I also think that that's part of why our young folks is because they see they look at the landscape and see hope and possibility, and are not daunted by the challenge that we have.
Yeah, well, they haven't spoken to church insurance,
young
so,
seminary.
that's the.
But what would you tell the church to do with a 28-year-old fresh grad out of div school in the Episcopal Church? How should the church set that person up for success that we haven't done in the last 20 or 30 years?
I think that so let's think about what we have a lot of endowments in the church, right? And to sort of speak broadly, there's two things that we could do with them. One is we could use them to preserve the past, and the other one is that we could use them to build the future. And I think part of that is that if you have the resources to employ a newly ordained 28-year-old, don't just have them do the stuff that you don't want to do, right? Actually think about that person as the person who is going to, part of that, and it's not going to be a lot of people, who are going to keep the church, in a sense, not just keep the church going, but make the church larger. Yeah. So are you making sure that they get the skills? Are you building resilience? Because after whatever, one of the things that we see is, so you're in a sort of an endowed parish, which is great, but then your next cure, you go along and, oh my gosh, there's this thing called a roof that is like 200, is 150 years old, and the slates are falling off, and the rain is coming in, and so you've got to, they can't teach everything in seminary, right? We always and I was with the Dean of Spokane yesterday, who deals with a whole set of issues around the drug crisis there, and people coming into the cathedral in enormous states of mental distress, and she said they didn't teach us this in seminary. And I'm not saying, Andrew, that you could teach all of that in seminary, but during, if you like, this interim period afterwards, then the resources are there in some of our larger parishes to nurture, to train, to build that next generation. And that's their responsibility, I think, to do.
So let me give you an evangelical model of how I would think this should go. There's something called church planting networks in the evangelical world. There's one called ARC, Association of Related Churches, Acts 29. There's one called the Sin Network, the Southern Baptists do. If you're a young pastor, you go to them and say, I want to start a church, and they put you through like a 3-day evaluation period, actually. And your wife has to come too, which is ridiculous, but here we are. And if you successfully complete that process, they will give you seed money to start a church. And we're talking a lot of money, $150,000, $200,000. And you can rent a place, you can get technology, it pays your salary for the first year. And then you have to come to their trainings twice a year to kind of give you those skills we're talking about, the soft skills, the financial skills, all those things. And then the theory is that once your church gets big enough, then you give 5% of your offering back to the network, which then reinvests in new churches. They have been incredibly successful, guys. ARC has, their whole mentality is start big, stay big. Their average first service for an ARC church is 300 people. 300. 90% of their churches survive the first 5 years, which is insanely high in this environment. I walked into a church at 24 where I was the youngest person by 40 years. We had a declining endowment. We had a 16,000 square foot building, needed a new roof. I mean, everything was against me. And it crushed me, honestly. It crushed me. Because I laid in bed at night and thought, why can't I grow this church? Why does God put me in this purgatory that I'm in right now? Why is this my lot in life? And I might have gone into full-time ministry if that first church would have gone a different direction, if I'm being honest with you right now. But it didn't. And now I probably won't be a pastor ever again because of that. Because of what that, not that I regret the last 17 years of my life. Don't mishear what I'm saying right now. But understand that whenever everything is against you, the finances are against you, the demography is against you, the time is against you, the age is against you, it's so hard to swim upstream that you just stop swimming at some point. And I think the best thing a denomination like mine or the Episcopal, don't put people in situations where they're going to fail. We all know there are meat grinder congregations out there. My denomination knows all about those meat, you know what I mean, that chew pastors up in a year or 2 years. Good luck. That is not, if you find a young person, I would say, how much money do you need and where would you like to plant a church? And how can we help you do that? Right? And if you need more money, come back. We will help you, because otherwise what you get is exactly this. Oh, you got to go through the gauntlet, right? You've got to go through orientation and all the hazing that goes on as a young priest. We don't have time for that, right? That is not where we are. There's not a huge pipeline of young priests trying to work their way up the system. They're jewels. There's so few of them now, they should be, I hate to use the word coddled, but coddled a little bit, right? Let's help you be successful. Because listen, if I would have started a church as opposed to having a 65 and up congregation, we'd be in a lot different spot right now. I mean, we got to be real about, not saying those congregations don't matter, by the way, and those people don't matter, because you know what I'm doing tomorrow? I'm doing a service for a guy who was 97 years old who died last week. I wanted to do his funeral, but also if my denomination wants to survive, we need to find a way for pastors like where I was 20 years ago to succeed in that local church context. You can hold both those ideas at the same time, right?
And I think the context piece really matters too, because we have, congregations in places where, they want the young pastor or they want the kids. Well, there aren't really kids around. So I think looking at that context, looking at your neighborhood and being the best church you can be for the context you're in is also really important, because there are places where the neighborhood is largely senior, or the place is full of young people, but they're not in the parish. So what's the disconnect? Is your congregation matching the neighborhood around you? And we have a tool on our website to help you do that. And are you matching the neighborhood around you? And what are the needs in that neighborhood? And how can this congregation, however big it is, and I think it's always important, I said this in our presentation yesterday, to remember that the markers of congregational vitality don't correlate with size. So you can be a vital congregation of any size. And so look at your context and see what there is. And so how can that congregation, wherever it is, best serve, and where are the places where there is growth and need that we don't have a place already?
Absolutely. We're almost out of time, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm shocked because, Ryan, of course, being a Baptist, came on and we were on a call, and I said, Molly and I were like, what's the structure here? Are we doing right one, right two, Eucharistic A, Eucharistic B?
Right two, please. Right two.
Ryan's like, we're just going to see where the Spirit takes us.
Absolutely.
And this made me very nervous, I have to say. But it's surprisingly, this has actually gone, rather like the Episcopal Church, we have beaten expectations.
Well, listen, I don't preach the manuscript. I just let it go. You know what I mean? You got to let things happen. If there was one metric, Matthew, that you wanted to think about, what would be the thing on the dashboard, right? The one thing that you look at that would determine where the church is going to be in 25 or 50 years?
Who's coming into the process?
Yeah.
What age they are, and do we have a demographics of ordinance that reflects not the church but society at large?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Same question to you, Molly. What do you think? One metric that would make you change your mind about the direction of things, or maybe not change your mind about the direction of things?
Well, I'm extraordinarily hopeful about the resources we have, both financially, right? Matthew was talking about endowment, right? The collective congregational endowments of the Episcopal Church is about $6 billion. Mm-hmm. So that's like not a small chunk of change. You could like make a real impact, and that's not including Trinity Wall Street, and that's not including our diocesan endowments or our church-wide funds.
Yep.
So we're definitely in the billions. So we could make a real impact with those kind of resources. And our resources are not just financial. Mm-hmm. They are hugely human. And so I think the metric is, how are we using those resources? Are we using them for the future? And how are we collaborating? And as Bishop Sean has said, how are we being one church with the enormous resources we have in a world that desperately needs them?
100%. If you die with a lot of money, you're still dead.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, let's be clear about this.
You can't take it with you.
You can't take it with you. And I think that's the worst thing to be is a zombie denomination. You know what I mean? Where you've got very few people, but you got a whole lot of money. That is not what the kingdom's about, as far as I can tell. Let me tell a quick story. 10 years ago, my church was on the way down, and we didn't have any hope of revival. I heard a pastor say, if your church closed, would anyone outside your congregation really care? Mm-hmm. And the answer at that point was no. We were so insular. So we started a program called Brown Bag Friday, where we packed 13 items in a brown paper sack of food and gave it to kids in our local school system. 80% of kids in my school, my kids' school, are on free or reduced lunch. It's one of the poorest districts in the state. The social workers were telling us kids would come to school on Monday and be hungry. They had nothing to eat. And we started with 30 bags, thinking that was all we could handle, because there's only like 15 of us, and we had no money. We ended up doing 225 bags a week at our peak, and the money never ran out. And the biggest concern we had in our last days was not the building or the vestments or the baptismal records. It was, who's going to take over Brown Bag Friday? Because that was our legacy. And we will have a legacy in our community for decades to come because of what those 20 people did with the limited resources they have. Just because it's over doesn't mean it's over. There's always hope on the horizon. You can always be the kingdom of God, whether you're 10 people, 100 people, or 1,000 people. I want to admonish you and encourage you to be the church. No matter how big you are, how small you are, how old you are, how young you are, you can still do the work of the kingdom wherever you are. God bless you.
Amen.